August 31, 1940, at the Underground Operations Room in Bentley Priory. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the quiet hum of a battle that seemed to be slipping away. It was 10 a.m. when the first reports filtered in, confirming that the Luftwaffe was once again massing over the French coast in numbers that defied the morning light. For Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, the numbers on the plotting table were more than just wooden blocks pushed by WAFs with long croupier poles. They represented the lifeblood of a nation. The British were losing. Between August 24 and September 6, the RF would lose 295 fighters destroyed and 171 badly damaged, but the most devastating figure was the 103 pilots killed and 128 seriously wounded. This was nearly a quarter of all the pilots Dowding had at his disposal. The airfields of 11 Group, situated in the southeast of England, were the primary targets of this relentless onslaught. By 1 p.m. that afternoon, Biggin Hill had been struck for the 6th time in 3 days. The damage was horrific. Workshops were leveled, the power was cut, and the telephone lines that linked the sector station to the radar chain were severed. Without these lines, the Dowding system, the world's most advanced air defense network, was becoming a blind giant. Ground crews worked with frantic desperation, filling bomb craters on the runways as the next wave of Junkers 88s appeared on the horizon. These men and women were the unsung heroes of the battle, staying at their posts while the earth erupted around them, but even their courage had its limits. The airfields were becoming graveyards of burnt-out machinery and shattered hangars. The human element was even closer to the breaking point. By 3:30 p.m., the pilots of 92 Squadron were being scrambled for their 4th sortie of the day. These young men, many barely 20 years old, were suffering from a level of fatigue that bordered on the hallucinatory. They were flying on adrenaline and tea, their eyes bloodshot from the glare of the sun and the lack of sleep. When they landed, they often didn't even leave their cockpits, waiting instead for the fuel bowsers and ammunition trucks to replenish their Spitfires so they could climb back into the killing zone. The loss of experienced squadron leaders was particularly felt. The tactical wisdom that kept a pilot alive was being bled out of fighter command, replaced by frantic recruits who had barely mastered the art of a steep turn before they were jumped by veteran Messerschmitt pilots from the Spanish Civil War. As 6 p.m. arrived, the sun began to cast long, golden shadows across the scarred landscape of Kent and Sussex. To an observer on the ground, the beauty of the English summer was in jarring contrast to the violence in the sky. Behind the scenes, the tension between Keith Park, commander of 11 Group, and Trafford Lee Mallory of 12 Group, was reaching a boiling point. They argued over tactics, over the big wing theory, and over the allocation of precious resources. But for the men in the cockpits, the debate was irrelevant. They were simply trying to survive the next 10 minutes. The British were not just on the ropes. They were leaning against them, waiting for the final, inevitable blow that would shatter the defense and clear the way for the German barges waiting in the ports of occupied France. By 9 p.m., the day's tallies were being finalized. It had been the worst day of the battle so far for fighter command. The resilience of the RAF was a miracle of logistics and stubbornness, but it was a miracle that was running out of time. If the Luftwaffe had maintained this surgical focus on the airfields and the command structure, the Battle of Britain would likely have ended in a German victory. The world stood on a precipice, watching as the last bastion of democracy in Europe flickered like a candle in a gale. This period of August 1940 remains a poignant reminder of how narrow the margin is between the survival of a civilization and its absolute ruin. It teaches us that courage is not always found in the grand charge, but in the exhausted mechanic filling a hole in the mud and the pilot climbing back into a burning sky when every rational thought tells him to stay on the ground. The legacy of these desperate hours is the debt we still owe to those who held the line when the line was all but broken, proving that even at the brink of collapse, The human spirit can yaw long enough for the enemy to make the one mistake that changes everything. August 24, 1940, over the darkened sprawl of London. The night sky is thick with clouds, and for a handful of Luftwaffe bomber crews, the world below has become a map of shadows. They are miles off their intended course, lost in a navigation error that will change the trajectory of the war. Their original targets were the oil refineries at Thameshaven and the aircraft factories on the outskirts of the city. But in the confusion of the blackout, they released their payloads directly onto the civilian heart of the British capital. High explosives tear through the east, shattering the unwritten rule that London was off-limits to deliberate terror bombing. This was not a calculated strategy. It was an accident born of fatigue and poor visibility. Yet, in the high-stakes chess match between Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler, an accident can be just as lethal as a planned offensive. Churchill recognizes the opportunity. Fighter command is bleeding out. Its airfields are cratered ruins, pilots are hallucinating from lack of sleep, and the radar network is hanging by a thread. If the Germans continue to hammer the airfields, the RF will cease to exist within weeks. Churchill needs to goad Hitler into a rage, to make him lose his military focus and replace it with a desire for pure retribution. On August 25, 24 hours after bombs fell on London, 81 British bombers take off for Berlin. It is a long, incredibly dangerous flight, and the damage they do is militarily negligible, but the psychological impact is seismic. For the first time, the citizens hear the wail of sirens. Hermann Göring had famously boasted that if a single enemy plane ever reached Berlin, people could call him Maya. Now, as smoke rises from the German capital, that boast tastes like ash. The response from the Berghof is one of uncontrolled fury. Hitler feels insulted. On September 4, at 4 p.m., he stands before a crowd at the Berlin Sportpalast, his voice trembling with manic energy. He mocks the British, asking why they have not been defeated yet, but his humor quickly turns to a dark promise of annihilation. He tells the cheering crowds that if the British drop 2,000 or 3,000 kilograms of bombs, the Germans will drop hundreds of thousands in a single night. He declares that he will erase their cities from the map. This is the moment the fatal mistake is solidified. The order is given to move the weight of the Luftwaffe away from the desperate RF sectors and onto the civilian population of London. On September 7 at 4 p.m., the massive first wave of nearly 1,000 aircraft crosses the coast. The sky is black with silhouettes of Heinkels and Dorniers, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitts. They bypass the airfields that were on the verge of collapse. They ignore the radar stations. They head straight for the docks and the residential streets of London. For the civilians on the ground, it is the beginning of an unthinkable nightmare. But for the exhausted ground crews and the battered squadrons of Biggin Hill, it is a miracle they cannot yet comprehend. The pressure is suddenly gone. While London burns, the RF is given the one thing it could not buy with blood: time. The shift to the Blitz was a tactical victory for the RF disguised as a humanitarian catastrophe. It reminds us that in the heat of total war, the ego of a dictator is often his greatest vulnerability. History is not just a series of planned movements. It is a chaotic web of accidents and emotional reactions. The ruins of the East and the craters in Berlin serve as a testament to the fact that, when leaders prioritize vengeance over strategy, they often inadvertently hand their enemies the keys to survival. The legacy of that accidental spark is a world where we understand that even in the darkest hours of a losing battle, a single moment of redirected fury can change the fate of empires. It tells us that resilience is not just about standing firm, but about surviving the storm long enough for the wind to change direction, often by the hand of the very person trying to break you and your nation. September 7, 1940, over the English Channel, the horizon began to darken with a mechanical cloud that seemed to defy the brilliance of the late summer sun. This was the day Hermann Göring had been waiting for, the moment he believed would finally bring the British Empire to its knees. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had been pounding the Royal Air Force's airfields, pushing the defiers to the absolute brink of collapse. Pilots were exhausted, ground crews were working amidst craters, and the vital sector stations were failing. But at 4 p.m., the tactical geometry of the war shifted in a way that defied military logic and embraced pure, unadulterated vengeance. Instead of turning toward the battered fighter bases in Kent and Sussex, the massive air armada of nearly 350 bombers and 600 fighters held its course, steering directly for the heart of the world's largest city. The people of London had grown used to the wail of the sirens, but the sound that reached the east that afternoon was different. It was not the distant drone of a few lost raiders. It was a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. By 4:30 p.m., the sky was thick with the twin-engine shapes of Heinkels and Dorniers, flanked by a swarm of Messerschmitts that glinted like silver needles. This was the start of the Blitz, a concentrated effort to break the civilian will through fire and steel. As the first sticks of bombs tumbled from the bays, the target was clear: the sprawling docks of the Thames, the literal warehouse of the Empire. Down on the ground, the scene was one of hellish transformation. Huge timber yards in the Surrey commercial docks caught fire, singing plumes of smoke thousands of feet into the air, creating a landmark that would guide German navigators for hours to come. The heat was so intense it melted the asphalt on the roads and turned the river into a ribbon of reflected fire. By 5:15 p.m., the east was a landscape of collapsing brick and rising screams. Yet, high above the carnage, a different story was unfolding for the men of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's fighter command. For the past 2 weeks, Dowding and Keith Park had watched their casualty rates climb to unsustainable levels. They were losing planes, and more importantly, experienced pilots faster than they could replace them. They were minutes away from losing the ability to control their own skies. But as the German formations bypassed the airfields and headed for London, the pressure on the RAF's infrastructure suddenly vanished. The very move Hitler intended as a finishing blow became, in reality, a miraculous reprieve. While Londoners suffered the unimaginable, the mechanics at Biggin Hill and Kenley were finally able to patch their runways and repair their telecommunications without the constant interruption of falling bombs. As the sun set, the first wave withdrew, only for a second wave of night bombers to find their way toward the city, guided by the massive fires that glowed like a beacon in the dark. At 8:07 p.m., the sirens wailed again, beginning a night of terror that would last until dawn. Thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries rained down on the civilian population. To the German High Command, it looked like victory. They saw the fires and assumed the British would sue for peace within days. They failed to realize they had just committed one of the greatest strategic blunders in the history of warfare. By shifting their focus to the city, they had stopped strangling the RF at the very moment the RF was about to die. The legacy of this day is written in the resilient spirit of the Londoners who crawled out of their shelters the next morning to find their streets gone but their country still in the fight. September 7th was the day the Battle of Britain changed from a tactical struggle for air superiority into a moral test of a nation's soul. It remains a poignant reminder that in the theater of war, the desire to humiliate a civilian population often blinds a leader to the practical steps required to defeat a military force. The fires of the East were a tragedy of immense proportions, yet they served as a funeral pyre for German hopes of a quick invasion. London burned so that the RAF could breathe, and in that breathing space, the tide of the entire Second World War began to turn. We look back at those smoke-filled skies and see more than just destruction. We see the moment when survival was snatched from the jaws of defeat by an enemy who mistook cruelty for strategy. It is a testament to the idea that even when a nation is at its most vulnerable, the urine of its people can become a shield that no amount of fire can melt. September 7, 1940. Along the wind-swept cliffs of Cap Gris-Nez in occupied France, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring stood in a state of triumphant anticipation. Beside him, High-ranking officers of the Luftwaffe watched as nearly 1,000 aircraft, hundreds of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, flanked by an even greater number of Messerschmitt fighters, crossed the coastline and began their transit over the English Channel. This was not just another raid. For weeks, the German air fleets had focused their fury on the grass airfields and radar stations of southern England, pushing the Royal Air Force to the absolute brink of extinction. But on this afternoon, at exactly 4 p.m., the navigators were ordered to bank their planes toward a new target. The objective was no longer the hangars of Biggin Hill or the control rooms of Manston. The objective was the sprawling, densely populated heart of the British Empire. London was about to pay the price for a tactical shift that would, in the final accounting of history, become one of Adolf Hitler's most consequential blunders. The first wave of bombers reached the Thames estuary at 4:48 p.m., finding a city that was largely unprepared for the sheer scale of the onslaught. For weeks, Londoners had watched the vapor trails of the Battle of Britain from a distance, feeling the tension but spared the direct fire. That changed in an instant as the sky over the east grew dark with the silhouettes of the Luftwaffe. Thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries rained down on the docks, the warehouses, and the crowded tenements of Stepney and Silvertown. By 6 p.m., the horizon was a jagged line of orange and black. The Surrey commercial docks were a literal inferno. The heat was so intense that it melted the tires of fire engines and caused the very river to boil as liquid sugar and timber fueled the flames. Firefighters, many of them part-time volunteers who had never seen a major blaze, found themselves battling fires so large they were categorized as conflagrations rather than mere accidents. While the civilians of London suffered through a night of unimaginable terror, a strange and vital silence fell over the fighter stations of 11 Group. At 11 p.m., as the second wave of German bombers used the fires of the city as a beacon to drop even more ordnance, the mechanics at the battered RF airfields were finally able to work without the threat of imminent destruction. For 2 weeks, these men had been repairing Spitfires and Hurricanes under constant bombardment, often filling in craters in the runways as the next squadron took off. The shift to London gave Air Vice Marshal Keith Park the breathing room his pilots desperately needed. The radar chain, which had been flickering near total failure, was left alone. The communications network, the literal nervous system of the British defense, began to be re-stithed. Goring believed he was delivering a knockout blow to a dying enemy, but in reality, he had stopped strangling the RF just as its breath was about to give out. The human cost of this strategic diversion was staggering. By 3 a.m. the following morning, over 400 civilians were dead, and thousands more were homeless, wandering the smoke-choked streets with whatever they could carry in their arms. The Luftwaffe had hoped that this display of raw power would break the British will and force a surrender before a single German boot touched English soil. They miscalculated the character of the city. Instead of panic, there was a grim, defiant solidification of purpose. People gathered in the underground stations, sharing tea and blankets, their fear hardening into a cold resentment of the enemy. The Blitz spirit was not born out of a lack of terror, but out of the realization that there was no longer any middle ground. It was survival or extinction. As the sun rose on the morning of September 8, the smoke from the docks was visible for 30 miles. To the German High Command, the mission looked like a resounding success. They saw a burning capital and assumed there was near. But beneath that smoke, the Royal Air Force was refueling, rearming, and rising. The shift to London was the fatal mistake that saved the United Kingdom. By sparing the airfields, the Germans allowed the RAF to rebuild its strength for the climactic battles of mid-September, when the Luftwaffe would find that the dead Air Force was very much alive. We look back at the ruins of Black Saturday and see a tragedy of immense proportions, but we also see the moment the tide began to turn. It is a haunting reminder that in the mathematics of war, a choice made in anger or a shift in target can alter the destiny of millions. The fire that consumed the East was a beacon of suffering, yet it provided the shadow in which a nation recovered its strength. The legacy of that day remains a testament to the fact that when an aggressor chooses to strike the heart of a people rather than their shield, they often find that the heart is the one thing they can never truly break. In the silence of the morning after, the charred docks stood as a monument to a survival that should have been impossible, marking the day when the hope of a quick victory for the Reich went up in the very smoke they had created, September 8, 1940, over the cratered runways of Biggin Hill. The smoke from the previous day's firestorm over London still drifted across the Thames, but for the first time in weeks, the skies directly above the Royal Air Force's fighter stations were strangely, eerily quiet. For the ground crews and weary pilots of 11 Group, this silence was not a sign of peace, but a miracle of tactical error. Hermann Göring, convinced that the RF was on its last legs, had ordered the Luftwaffe to turn its full fury away from the airfields and toward the civilian heart of the capital. It was a pivot born of frustration and ego, and it was precisely the reprieve that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had been praying for. Before this shift, the situation was dire. At Manston Kenley and Biggin Hill, the ground was a moonscape of jagged earth and twisted metal. Since mid-August, the Luftwaffe had pounded these vital nerves of the British defense system with surgical persistence. Telephone lines, the very veins through which the Dowding system pulsed, had been severed repeatedly. Operations rooms had been forced into makeshift bunkers or underground cellars. At 10 a.m. on many of those previous mornings, the airfields were barely functional, with ground crews working under fire to fill craters so that a single flight of Hurricanes could take off. The system was frayed, the pilots were broken, and the organization was at the absolute limit of its endurance. But as the German bombers banked toward the east of London, the pressure on the perimeter defenses vanished. The rebuilding process began in earnest. Every available hand was pressed into service. Civilian contractors, WWII members, and weary mechanics labored around the clock under the late summer sun. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, the frantic clatter of shovels and the roar of steamrollers replaced the sound of falling bombs. They weren't just filling holes. They were restoring the critical infrastructure of the world's first integrated air defense system. Engineers reconnected the subterranean cables that linked radar stations to the plotting rooms, ensuring that the eyes of the nation were once again wide open. The human cost of the preceding weeks had been staggering. Pilots were flying 5 or 6 sorties a day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before climbing back into the cockpit. They were falling asleep in their flight gear, some so exhausted they had to be lifted into their planes by the ground staff. This sudden shift in German strategy allowed for a rotation of squadrons that would have been impossible just 48 hours earlier. Fresh pilots from the north were brought down to the front lines, while the battered remnants of the veteran units were sent to quieter sectors to recuperate. The industrial machine was also catching up. Lord Beaverbrook's feverish drive for aircraft production meant that new Spitfires were arriving at the depots faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. At 5:15 p.m., as the sun began to dip, rows of newly delivered fighters were being taxied into repaired hangars. By the time the next major assault arrived, the RAF would not just be surviving, it would be reinforced and reorganized. Had the Luftwaffe continued its assault on the airfields for just 5 more days, the history of Europe might have been written in a different language. The sector stations were the shield of the nation. By ignoring the shield to strike at the heart, the German High Command committed one of the greatest strategic blunders in the history of aerial warfare. They mistook the visibility of London's burning docks for the destruction of Britain's ability to fight back. The breathing room of September 1940 was a bridge between near collapse and ultimate defiance. It was during these hours of relative calm over the airfields that the Battle of Britain was truly won, not in a spectacular dogfight, but in the grease-stained hands of a mechanic and the steady heartbeat of a rested pilot. The legacy of this period is a reminder that the resilience of a nation is often found in its ability to repair what is broken, while the enemy is distracted by the spectacle of destruction. When we look back at the soot-stained maps of Fighter Command, we see more than just tactical movements. We see the moment a desperate defense transformed into an iron wall. The mistake made by the aggressor was thinking that fire could consume a resolve that was forged in the very heat they provided. The airfields stood firm, the pilots returned to the sky, and the narrow window of opportunity for an invasion slammed shut forever. It remains a testament to the fact that strength is not just measured by the power of a strike, but by the quiet, tireless work of rebuilding in the shadows of the storm. September 7, 1940, across the scarred landscape of southern England, the trajectory of the Second World War shifted on a single, catastrophic command. It is often in the heat of a perceived victory that the most profound defeats are born. As the first bombs fell on the London docks at 4:48 p.m., the German High Command believed they were witnessing the final act of a broken nation. They saw the fires, the crumbling brickwork, and the terror in the streets, and they concluded that there was near. But history tells a different story. By shifting their focus away from the bleeding airfields of Fighter Command, the Luftwaffe inadvertently granted the Royal Air Force the one thing it needed most to survive: time. The cost of this survival was borne by the civilians of London, who stood in the gap so that the pilots could return to the sky. It was a brutal, unintended exchange. For weeks, the airfields of Sector 11 had been hammered into uselessness. Mechanics were working by candlelight in ruined hangars, and pilots were flying 5 or 6 sorties a day, fueled by nothing but adrenaline. The British air defense system was at its absolute breaking point. If the German pressure had continued on the radar stations and the runways for even another week, the narrow corridor of air superiority required for a cross-channel invasion might have been forced open. But by 5 p.m. on that fateful Saturday, the pressure simply evaporated. The German bombers passed over the airfields and headed for the city. In the quiet that followed at Biggin Hill and Kenley, there was a sense of disbelief. The ground crews didn't question why the raids had stopped. They simply picked up their shovels and began to fill the craters. They worked through the evening, and by 8 a.m. the following morning, the airfields were operational again. The fatal mistake had been made. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring had chosen vengeance over strategy, and in doing so, they signed the death warrant of Operation Sea Lion. We must reflect on what would have happened if that choice had been different. If the Luftwaffe had finished the job, the United Kingdom would have been stripped of its shield. There would have been no staging ground for the liberation of Europe. The United States would have found itself facing a fortress continent with no frilly port to call home. Western democracy, as we know it today, would have been extinguished or forced into a long and dark exile across the Atlantic. The decision to bomb London preserved the bridgehead from which the world would eventually reclaim its freedom. This moment teaches us that the greatest strength of a free society is often its ability to absorb a blow and refuse to break. The German leadership failed to understand that while they could burn a city, they could not burn the will of the people who inhabited it. They mistook the physical destruction of buildings for the moral destruction of a civilization. In reality, every bomb that fell on London only served to harden the resolve of those who were watching from the cockpit of a Spitfire or a Hurricane. The airmen knew they were no longer just fighting for a military victory. They were fighting for the very lives of their families on the ground. As we look back at the soot-stained maps and the grainy footage of that era, we see more than just a tactical blunder. We see the hand of fate moving through the arrogance of a dictator. The legacy of September 7, 1940, is found in the silence of a channel that was never crossed. It is found in the continued existence of an independent Britain and the eventual crumbling of the Reich. We are the inheritors of a world shaped by that single afternoon of tactical insanity. The lesson is poignant and timeless. It reminds us that in the darkest hours of human history, the margin between total collapse and eventual triumph can be as thin as a single change in orders. The airfields were saved by the cities, and the cities were saved by the airfields, in a cycle of sacrifice that defined a generation. We owe our current peace to that narrow escape, to the urence of the many, and to the tactical blindness of an enemy who thought terror was a substitute for victory. In the final analysis, the mistake of the aggressor was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine a people who would grow stronger in the furnace. They could not imagine a defense that would rebuild itself while the sky was still falling. Because of that failure, the lights of democracy remained flickering in the darkness of Europe, until they eventually grew into a flame that would consume the very tyranny that tried to extinguish them. The legacy of that day is not just a military milestone. It is the enduring proof that when a free people choose to stand together, not even the fire of 1,000 bombers can break the spirit of a nation determined to live.